I'm Kalila Harris for The Real News Network. Former New York City Mayor and possible 2020 presidential candidate Michael Bloomberg has donated $1.8 billion to his alma mater, Johns Hopkins University. But is that the best way to address educational equity? Bloomberg announced the donation through an editorial in the New York Times. In it, he argued that the gift would allow students to attend the elite university who otherwise would not be able to afford it. He noted that the country's most selective colleges are dominated by students from the top 1%, an imbalance he hoped his gift would help to address, while acknowledging private philanthropy cannot alone stem the tide of the lack of affordability for college. But is donating money to an elite institution really the best way to address educational inequity? And is there a better way to use the money to give students from families with low incomes access to advanced education? We spoke to Hopkins professor of political science, Lester Spence, to explore this question and more. So when you heard about the donation from Bloomberg, what were your initial reactions?
I had a few different reactions. I thought that Hopkins, unlike many of its peers, hasn't really been need blind in admissions. That is, I think that they've been looking at if an applicant that's going to require some type of financial aid, if they apply to the university, they're going to take that application and they're going to give that application, they're not going to treat that application the same as if somebody applied that didn't have need. So a number of universities higher up the ladder have moved to need blind admissions, and Hopkins just hadn't been able to do it. So I thought that it was wonderful that Bloomberg gave the money and explicitly wanted that money used towards making Hopkins more open to lower income students. There are a number of people who've been fighting that struggle within Hopkins for years.
And what do you say to the people who would offer that even with need blind admissions, the lack of equity in the K-12 space in terms of access to the type of preparation that would get you into a Hopkins in some ways makes that kind of donation and a need blind process kind of moot?
I'd agree. I'd push back just a little bit, right? In that we want a dynamic. Okay, so the world we want is a world in which every kid, no matter where they go to school, no matter what neighborhood they grow up in, no matter who their parents are, they have the capacity to live full, rich lives. We want, along those lines, we want college to the ability to attend a college like Hopkins not to be structured by how much loot your family has, you know, what type of high school you go to, what type of zip code you go to. We want that. And then we want some other things too. If that's let's say that's not our Z point. Let's say that's our M point. We're at A. How do we get to M? Right? So one way we get to M is by taking something like this and saying, wow, that's okay, but, right? Like what type of money is being put, like in Baltimore, what type of money is being put in your regular high school versus something like a City, Poly, or Western, or in the Detroit case, what's in your regular high school versus a Cass, King, or a Renaissance, or in your St. Louis case, a Gateway or a Metro, et cetera. Then the question is like, okay, we're all about putting more resources in K through 12 through foundations. That's not really a foundation's job. That's a government's job, right? How do we do that? And in that instance, if you read the Bloomberg's own statement about it, he says clearly, this is a job government should do. So we take advantage of that rhetoric to say, well, listen, he's saying it. We can find other instances of wealthy folks saying it, and then combine that with movement that's been going on. There have been people organizing for decades to make public college tuition free. I can point to Adolph Reed and the work of the Labor Party in the mid-90s, who've been arguing that, and this is way before the second Iraq War, where they priced it out. I think maybe it cost $30 billion or something like that to make public college free. Right, so we take an instance like this and we acknowledge it's deeply imperfect, we acknowledge it's flawed, but it gets us closer to that end moment.
How do you respond to people who say that this type of gift from Bloomberg is short-sighted and should be spread across institutions that are actually serving those kids who come from K-12 environments that weren't as rich and robust, but those institutions decided to take them anyway and have expertise in moving them across the line to graduation?
That's a version of the we need our own billionaire. Right? And that critique, while I understand it, the danger of that critique is that what it's basically saying is that it's kind of a racial equity critique, where it takes the structure of capitalism for granted and then just says, well, what we need is a more equitable distribution of that capital, as opposed to saying, you know, this structure is problematic. You know what I mean? So there are people on Twitter who argued, for example, like Bloomberg was a New York mayor. Why doesn't he give that money to CUNY? Right? And there was a time when CUNY was producing dope scholars and was free. Right? Then there are brothers and sisters who are like, wow, I mean, Howard could use that money. Morgan State could use that money. Right? And that's absolutely right. But at the same time, the danger with that is like, okay, what we want to do is get to a point where we're saying that this isn't the model we should be using in general, right? This model is deeply, deeply flawed. It just reproduces the gap between the haves and have-nots, right? Like maybe in this case, it brings Hopkins closer to people it believes to be its peers, but it further separates Hopkins and its peers from public colleges and then private colleges with little to no resources.
So what steps would you encourage governments to take to make the situation more equitable, right? As opposed to adopting the same capitalistic structure?
So we have to segue at the local, state, and federal level towards a dynamic where schools like Hopkins are actually paying taxes instead of providing services in kind, right? So like Hopkins, and most schools like it have kind of an arrangement with the city where instead of giving taxes, they provide expertise or a range of other services. I think that we should be paying taxes. That's the first thing, because there's a lot of tax revenue that's just going by the wayside. And we already know in a city like Baltimore is resource poor, in part for a number of reasons. But when you've got them on the one hand giving $600 million basically to Under Armour and then not taking in taxes from an entity like Hopkins, that just makes them further unable to provide services that Baltimore citizens need, public services that Baltimore citizens need. Secondarily, we need to be moving more towards a dynamic where people shouldn't be paying for college. And we start out with schools like the University of Michigan, go Blue, the University of Maryland, and then we move out to include private colleges.
What would you say to someone saying, you know, well, even if college were free, there are colleges not serving anyone, and should they be getting funded to not provide quality education?
I think what's missing there is kind of an understanding about how funding works, how public funding works, right? So if it's publicly funded, there's a mechanism of accountability. Now that mechanism of accountability is imperfect, but we're not just talking about giving loot to somebody and then sending them on their merry way. We're talking about public funding, where actually citizens have the capacity, a far more capacity they do in private institutions, to say, like, listen, this is what we expect, given that this is our institution, right? Because the thing is, it's about giving resources, yes, but it's also about further cementing the idea that that schools like Michigan, which really are public schools, but actually in part because of state clawbacks, they really act more like private schools than public schools. But these public schools actually belong to citizens, right? And even private schools like Hopkins has a public mission. So it's about the funding, yes, but it's about restoring a relationship between citizens and the institutions that are supposed to be ours.
Do you have any questions or concerns about implementation?
So you could just do the math and just do that. You could say, wow, about 900 kids or something like that end up can get into school without having to worry about loot where before they would, right? But then the question is, if we're talking about low-income students, and a number of those are going to be first-generation students, what type of infrastructure is going to be created to build Hopkins out where they can actually give that population, that growing population, the skills they need to actually thrive and transform the school, right? So we can imagine a dynamic, and what they want is, and this is something I would want as well, they want Hopkins to get to the point that at least 20% of their kids are kids coming from lower income backgrounds. And for me, that's a floor, but not a ceiling, but that's a floor we should fight for, right? But I can imagine a dynamic. I'm not going to mention any names, but I remember when I was a kid at Michigan, and there was a kid younger than me who grew up in, not in Detroit, I have to say that, not in Detroit, but he grew up in another hard-hit neighborhood, and he became a peer advisor. And when he was a peer advisor, another working class kid got into some trouble, and he had to come before the peer advisor, right, including him. And that peer advisor told that kid, you need to leave the ghetto at home, right? And he thought he was doing, I shouldn't even say the gender, but he thought he was doing the right thing. But I remember thinking as a kid, right? Like, no, you don't tell somebody that. What we want is we want schools like Hopkins to change to reflect us. We don't want to come into a school, like as a professor, I don't come into Hopkins and change myself for Hopkins. Like, I'm supposed to be here.
Any other final thoughts you'd want to share?
I think it's really, really important that we embed our critiques of capital and capitalism, and it's possible to have a trenchant critique of capitalism while still believing somebody's motives when they say, for example, I really want to help lower income students, right? Because if we're not able to do that, if we're not able to do that both and move, to say, okay, I believe Bloomberg when he says he wants to help kids, and say this is a really, really bad model, then that basically builds into our critique this idea that in order to really contest capitalism, we need capitalists to be evil and duplicitous, right? And that's actually not the case. I mean, in a lot of cases, they are, but there are capitalists that we really strongly disagree with, and we want another world that actually that will simultaneously say that we want police to stop and frisk on one hand, and we want to create more opportunities for lower income kids on the other, and hold both those ideas at the same time and believe in them strongly, right? That's what we're fighting, and we have to be able to articulate it clearly, because I don't believe, in this case, Bloomberg's been giving money to Hopkins for years, and he's been giving, as long as I've been here, most of his funding has been about kind of building Hopkins' capacity to learn and to research, and then providing resources to folks in need.
Some people have said that he's doing this to support how he appears to the public for his potential run for president.
That's probably part of it. But I don't think that's the guiding factor. I don't think that's part of it. And that's empirically testable, right? That is to say that, you know, if it happens and he's running, and every time he's running, he's like here in Baltimore with some kid who went to school through his money, then we'll know. So I want y'all to come back. So hopefully we'll all be around in a few years. Y'all can come back and be like, yo, you was wrong. And I'll be like, yeah, damn, I was wrong on that. I tend to think I can go at somebody pretty hard and still take them at their word. So I think that is part of that, but I don't think it's the big part of it. And and it's also, and again, it's important to note, people at Hopkins have been fighting for this for years. That's actually really important. Some folks who aren't even here anymore, right? Some scholars who, I can think of one scholar in particular, he's at Brown now. People have been fighting in Hopkins for this for years. So the other thing is that we're not necessarily, by solely thinking about this as something that he did for his own purposes, we're not actually taking into account the politics that that happened within Hopkins, right? That actually led to, because what probably happened is President Daniels has been probably urging him for years to do this. It's probably been in dialogue, and that dialogue doesn't come without people at Hopkins, students, faculty, staff, administrators fighting for that. So that's the other thing to actually keep in mind.
This is Kalila Harris for The Real News. If you like this and other reporting, please consider making a donation at www.therealnews.com/donate.